A little wild foal kept following the rancher, desperate for help. But when the rancher realized why, he broke down in tears. What happens next will leave you speechless. Marcus Whitfield had been running the Copper Ridge Ranch in the remote valleys of Montana for over 15 years, a sprawling property he inherited from his grandfather that stretched across 3,000 acres of rugged terrain. The weathered rancher, now in his early 40s with calloused hands and sun-beaten skin, had seen his share of wildlife encounters, from curious deer to the occasional black bear, but nothing had prepared him for what would unfold on that crisp October morning. As he rode his trusted bay gelding, Thunder, along the eastern fence line checking for winter storm damage, Marcus noticed something unusual moving through the tall prairie grass near Willow Creek. At first, he thought it might be a stray calf from his neighbor's herd, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a young Mustang foal, probably no more than 3 months old, with a distinctive white blaze running down its chestnut face and 4 white socks that made it stand out against the golden autumn landscape. The little horse was alone, which immediately concerned Marcus, as foals at that age should never be separated from their mothers, especially with winter approaching and temperatures already dropping below freezing at night. What struck Marcus as particularly odd was the foal's behavior. Instead of running away as wild horses typically do when they encounter humans, this little one seemed to be deliberately following him, keeping pace with Thunder at a respectful distance of about 50 yards. Every time Marcus stopped to examine a section of fencing or dismounted to repair a loose wire, the foal would stop too, watching him with large, intelligent brown eyes that seemed to convey a sense of urgency. When Marcus resumed his work and moved along the fence line, the foal would resume following, sometimes nickering softly as if trying to communicate something important. This continued for nearly 2 hours as Marcus completed his morning rounds, and he found himself growing increasingly puzzled by the animal's persistent behavior. Wild Mustangs in this region were notoriously skittish around humans, the result of generations of survival instincts that kept them safe from predators and human interference, yet this foal seemed almost desperate to maintain contact with him. As the sun climbed higher and Marcus began heading back toward the ranch house for his midday meal, he noticed the foal had moved closer, now maintaining a distance of only about 30 yards. The little horse appeared healthy enough, no obvious signs of injury or malnutrition, but there was something in its demeanor that suggested distress beyond simple separation from its herd. Marcus had always possessed an intuitive understanding of horses, a gift his grandfather claimed ran in their family bloodline, and every instinct told him this foal needed help, though he couldn't yet determine what kind of assistance it required. The rancher's practical mind told him to continue with his daily routine and let nature take its course, as interference with wild animals often caused more harm than good, but his heart urged him to investigate further. He had heard stories from other ranchers about orphaned foals that had been taken in and successfully domesticated, though such cases were rare and required enormous amounts of time, patience, and resources that Marcus wasn't sure he could spare during the demanding autumn season. The mystery deepened when Marcus reached the ranch's main gate, and the foal still hadn't given up its pursuit, even approaching to within 20 yards of the barnyard where his domestic horses were kept in their paddocks. His 3 ranch horses, Thunder, a sturdy quarter horse named Dakota, and an aging mare called Sage, all lifted their heads to observe the newcomer with mild curiosity, but showed no signs of recognition that might indicate this foal belonged to a local wild herd they were familiar with. Marcus dismounted and stood quietly by the gate, studying the foal's movements and trying to read the subtle signals that horses communicate through body language, ear position, and vocal sounds. The little Mustang stood perfectly still, ears pricked forward in Marcus's direction, occasionally pawing the ground with one front hoof in what appeared to be frustration or impatience, as if waiting for the rancher to understand something vitally important that it was trying to convey. As Marcus unsaddled Thunder and led him into the barn for his afternoon feed and rest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from ordinary, and that the foal's unusual behavior was the beginning of something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the relationship between wild horses and the humans who shared their vast Montana landscape. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as he finished his barn chores, and when he emerged, the foal was still there, positioned near the gate like a patient sentinel, waiting for whatever would come next in this strange and unexpected dance between 2 very different worlds that were about to collide in ways neither could anticipate. The following morning brought a light dusting of snow and temperatures that made Marcus's breath visible in small puffs as he stepped onto his front porch with his first cup of coffee, only to discover the foal had spent the entire night near his property line, huddled against a cluster of pine trees that provided minimal shelter from the bitter wind. The sight tugged at something deep in Marcus's chest, a mixture of admiration for the little horse's determination and growing concern for its welfare as winter weather began to assert its dominance over the high country. After completing his morning chores and feeding his own horses, Marcus decided to approach the situation more systematically, mounting Thunder and riding out to where the foal waited with what seemed like infinite patience. This time, instead of continuing with his ranch work, he dismounted about 40 yards from the foal and sat quietly on a fallen log, allowing the young Mustang to dictate the terms of their interaction while he observed its behavior more closely. What Marcus discovered during this patient observation session both fascinated and puzzled him further. The foal's actions weren't random or driven by simple curiosity, but appeared to follow a deliberate pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose beyond what he would expect from such a young animal. Every few minutes, the foal would take several steps in a specific direction, then turn back to look at Marcus with an expression that seemed almost expectant, as if waiting for him to follow. When Marcus remained seated on his log, the foal would repeat this behavior, sometimes adding a soft whinny that sounded remarkably like the calls domestic horses used when trying to lead humans to something important, such as an empty water trough or an open gate. The direction the foal kept indicating was northeast, toward a section of wilderness that Marcus rarely visited because it was beyond his property boundaries and consisted of steep ravines and dense forest that made horseback travel treacherous even for experienced riders. After nearly an hour of this peculiar communication dance, Marcus's curiosity finally overcame his caution, and he remounted Thunder to follow where the foal seemed determined to lead him. The little Mustang immediately responded with what could only be described as visible relief, trotting ahead with renewed energy while frequently looking back to ensure Marcus was still following. Their unusual procession wound through increasingly challenging terrain, past rocky outcroppings, and through stands of aspen trees whose golden leaves carpeted the ground with a rustling blanket that muffled Thunder's hoofbeats. The foal navigated this difficult landscape with the sure-footedness that only wild horses possess, finding paths through the wilderness that Marcus's experienced eye could barely detect, demonstrating an intimate knowledge of the land that spoke to generations of Mustang survival skills passed down through genetic memory. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Marcus began to feel increasingly uneasy about leaving his ranch responsibilities behind for what might turn out to be a wild goose chase. But something about the foal's unwavering determination kept him committed to seeing this journey through to whatever destination awaited them. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they reached a narrow canyon that Marcus had never explored, its entrance hidden behind a screen of dense pine trees that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. The foal paused at the canyon's mouth, turning to face Marcus with an expression that seemed to say, "This is it," before disappearing into the shadowy passage beyond the trees, leaving the rancher with no choice but to follow if he wanted answers to the questions that had been building in his mind since the previous morning. The canyon floor was carpeted with pine needles and dotted with massive boulders that had tumbled from the walls above during countless seasons of freeze-thaw cycles, creating a natural obstacle course that required careful navigation, even for Thunder's steady feet. As they ventured deeper into this hidden landscape, Marcus noticed that the canyon walls were adorned with ancient petroglyphs, suggesting that this place had been significant to indigenous peoples long before European settlers arrived in the territory, and he wondered if the foal's knowledge of this location was somehow connected to the deep historical relationship between horses and the native tribes who had once called this land home. The silence in the canyon was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of their passage and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that made Marcus feel as though he was being drawn into something far larger and more meaningful than a simple rescue mission for a lost foal. The canyon twisted and turned for what felt like miles, though Marcus suspected they had traveled only a fraction of that distance through the winding passage that seemed to exist in its own pocket of time and space, separate from the familiar world of his ranch and the predictable rhythms of cattle and horses and seasonal work that had defined his life for so many years. When they finally emerged into a hidden valley that opened up like a secret garden nestled between towering stone walls, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight that greeted him, a pristine alpine meadow dotted with wildflowers that had somehow survived the recent frost, fed by a crystal-clear stream that meandered through the grass like a silver ribbon reflecting the afternoon sky. But it wasn't the natural beauty of this hidden sanctuary that made Marcus's heart begin to race with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. It was the unmistakable evidence of human habitation that shouldn't have existed in this remote and inaccessible location. Near the center of the valley stood a small log cabin that appeared to have been built decades earlier, its weathered walls and moss-covered roof suggesting it had been abandoned for many years. Yet something about the structure seemed oddly well preserved for a building that should have been reclaimed by the wilderness long ago. Scattered around the cabin were the remnants of what had once been a functional homestead, a collapsed barn, the remains of split-rail fencing, and what appeared to be the ruins of a stone foundation that might have supported a larger building at some point in the distant past. The foal trotted directly toward the cabin with the confidence of someone returning home after a long absence, pausing only to look back and ensure that Marcus was still following. And as they drew closer to the structure, the rancher began to notice details that made his pulse quicken with a growing sense of unease about what they might discover inside. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth near the cabin's front door indicated that someone had been here recently, possibly within the last few days, and the tracks appeared to belong to a heavy vehicle, perhaps a truck or SUV capable of navigating the rough terrain that Marcus had assumed made this valley inaccessible to motorized transportation. As he dismounted from Thunder and approached the cabin on foot, Marcus could see that several of the windows had been boarded up from the inside, while others showed signs of recent repair work that suggested someone had been maintaining the property despite its apparent abandonment. The foal had positioned itself near what appeared to be a small corral behind the cabin, pawing at the ground and nickering with increasing urgency, drawing Marcus's attention to an area where the earth had been recently disturbed, as if someone had been digging or burying something in that location within the past few weeks. The front door of the cabin stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the mountain breeze, and as Marcus approached with growing caution, he could detect the faint odor of wood smoke and something else he couldn't immediately identify, a chemical smell that seemed out of place in this wilderness setting and triggered alarm bells in his mind based on stories he had heard from law enforcement friends about illegal activities that sometimes took place in remote locations far from prying eyes. The foal's behavior had become increasingly agitated, circling the disturbed area behind the cabin while vocalizing in a way that Marcus had never heard from any horse, wild or domestic, a sound that conveyed distress and urgency on a level that transcended normal animal communication and seemed to carry an almost human quality of desperation and pleading for help. When Marcus finally worked up the courage to push open the cabin door and peer inside, the sight that greeted him explained everything about the foal's strange behavior while simultaneously raising a host of new questions that would challenge his understanding of right and wrong in ways he had never anticipated. The interior of the cabin had been converted into what was clearly a sophisticated drug manufacturing operation, with tables covered in chemical equipment, bags of white powder stacked against the walls, and the unmistakable paraphernalia associated with the production of illegal substances that Marcus recognized from television news reports about law enforcement raids on similar facilities. But what made his blood run cold and brought tears to his eyes wasn't the criminal activity itself. It was the evidence scattered throughout the cabin that indicated at least one person had been living here recently, and that person had apparently been caring for a small herd of wild horses that were now nowhere to be seen. The evidence of human habitation was heartbreakingly clear as Marcus moved through the cabin with growing horror at what he was discovering. Children's clothing scattered on makeshift beds, toys that had seen better days but were obviously treasured possessions, and most damning of all, school books and homework assignments bearing the name Tommy Brennan, age 8, in a child's careful handwriting that spoke of innocence existing in the midst of circumstances no young person should ever have to endure. In the corner of the main room, Marcus found a collection of photographs that revealed the true scope of the tragedy unfolding before him. Images of a man in his 30s with kind eyes and work-worn hands, obviously the boy's father, standing alongside the same foal that had led Marcus to this place, as well as several adult horses that were clearly part of a small wild herd that had been living in this hidden valley under human protection. The dates on the photographs indicated they had been taken over the course of several months, showing the gradual development of trust between the man and the horses, with young Tommy often visible in the background, learning to care for the animals that had become his only companions in this isolated wilderness existence. Further investigation revealed a journal written in the same adult handwriting that appeared on various notes and lists throughout the cabin, and as Marcus read the entries with growing understanding and sympathy, the full picture of what had happened here began to emerge like pieces of a tragic puzzle falling into place. The journal belonged to David Brennan, a single father who had been forced to flee his former life after witnessing a crime that put both him and his young son in mortal danger from powerful people who would stop at nothing to silence them permanently. David's entries described their arrival in this hidden valley 6 months earlier, their gradual adaptation to life completely off the grid, and his growing relationship with the wild horse herd that had accepted them as part of their extended family, with Tommy forming a particularly strong bond with the young foal that would later become their unlikely messenger and salvation. The journal's most recent entries, dated just 1 week earlier, revealed David's growing paranoia about being discovered by the people who had been hunting them, his concerns about winter approaching and their limited supplies, and most tragically, his description of symptoms that suggested he was suffering from some kind of serious illness that was progressively getting worse without access to proper medical care. The final entry, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, described David's decision to make one last trip to the nearest town to obtain medicine and supplies, leaving Tommy hidden in a cave system deeper in the valley with instructions to stay put until his return, but warning that if something happened to prevent his return, the boy should try to signal for help using the horses, who had proven remarkably intelligent and capable of finding their way to areas where humans might spot them and investigate. As Marcus pieced together the timeline from the journal entries and other evidence scattered throughout the cabin, he realized that David had likely been captured or killed during his supply run, leaving 8-year-old Tommy alone in the wilderness for nearly a week with only the horses for company and protection. The foal's persistent following of Marcus now made perfect sense. It had been trying to lead him back to Tommy, who was probably frightened, possibly injured, and certainly running out of food and water in whatever hiding place his father had prepared for him. The drug manufacturing equipment in the cabin was clearly not David's operation, but rather belonged to the criminals who had been using this remote location for their illegal activities before David and Tommy's arrival, and who had probably returned to find their operation compromised by the unexpected presence of witnesses they couldn't afford to leave alive. The urgency of the situation hit Marcus like a physical blow as he realized that somewhere in this vast wilderness, a terrified child was waiting for a father who would never return, with only wild horses as his guardians and winter weather that could prove fatal within days if Tommy wasn't found and brought to safety immediately. The foal stood outside the cabin, pacing restlessly and calling to Marcus with increasing desperation, as if it understood that time was running out, and that this human who had finally answered its call for help needed to understand the critical importance of following it to wherever Tommy was hidden. Marcus's hands shook as he folded the journal and stuffed it into his jacket pocket, knowing that this document contained evidence that could help bring dangerous criminals to justice while also serving as a testament to a father's love and sacrifice for his son's safety and survival. The afternoon was rapidly giving way to evening, and Marcus knew that attempting to navigate unfamiliar wilderness terrain in darkness would be not only dangerous, but potentially fatal for both him and Tommy, especially if the boy was injured or suffering from exposure after nearly a week alone in the elements. Yet the thought of that child spending another night alone in the wilderness, not knowing that help had finally arrived, was more than Marcus could bear, and he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would follow the foal wherever it led, trusting in the intelligence and loyalty of an animal that had already proven its devotion to the human family it had adopted, even if it meant risking everything in a race against time, weather, and the possibility that the criminals responsible for this tragedy might return to eliminate any remaining witnesses to their activities. The foal led Marcus deeper into the valley's maze of rock formations and hidden passages, following what appeared to be an ancient game trail that wound between massive boulders and through groves of pine trees that had been growing in this protected environment for centuries, their towering trunks creating a natural cathedral that filtered the fading daylight into patterns of gold and shadow on the forest floor. As they climbed higher into the valley's remote reaches, Marcus could hear the sound of running water growing stronger, suggesting they were approaching the source of the stream that fed the valley's lush grasslands, and after nearly an hour of careful navigation through increasingly difficult terrain, they emerged at the base of a towering cliff face where a waterfall cascaded down from hidden springs somewhere high above their heads. The foal approached a section of the cliff that appeared solid from a distance, but revealed itself to be the entrance to a cave system when viewed from the correct angle, and Marcus realized with growing admiration for David Brennan's survival skills that this natural fortress would be nearly impossible for anyone to find without intimate knowledge of the valley's geography and the guidance of someone who had mapped every secret passage and hidden refuge. The cave entrance was partially concealed by a screen of falling water from the falls above, requiring Marcus to lead Thunder through what amounted to a natural curtain that soaked them both to the skin, but provided perfect camouflage for anyone seeking to remain hidden from pursuing enemies. Inside the cave, Marcus found evidence of recent habitation: a sleeping bag, several empty food cans, a small camping stove, and most importantly, fresh footprints in the sandy cave floor that were clearly made by a child's boots within the last day or two, indicating that Tommy was not only alive, but had been moving around inside the cave system, possibly searching for his father or trying to find his way back to the outside world. The foal entered the cave without hesitation, moving deeper into the passages with the confidence of an animal that had been here many times before, and Marcus followed with Thunder's reins in one hand and his flashlight in the other, calling out Tommy's name in what he hoped was a reassuring voice that would identify him as a friend rather than a threat. The response came from deep within the cave system, a child's voice, weak and frightened but unmistakably alive, calling back, "Dad? Is that you? Please, I'm scared and I can't find the way out." Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he called back that he wasn't Tommy's father, but was there to help, following the sound of the boy's voice through a series of connected chambers until his flashlight beam illuminated a small figure huddled in a natural alcove, wrapped in a blanket and clutching a stuffed horse that had obviously been his constant companion during the terrifying ordeal of the past week. Tommy Brennan was thin and dirty, with the hollow-eyed look of a child who had been through trauma beyond his years, but he was alert and responsive, and when he saw the foal that had served as his messenger and lifeline to the outside world, his face lit up with the first genuine smile he had probably managed since his father's disappearance. The reunion between Tommy and the foal was heartbreaking in its intensity, with the child throwing his arms around the young horse's neck, while both of them vocalized their relief and joy at being reunited after what must have seemed like an eternity of separation and uncertainty. As Marcus helped Tommy gather his few possessions and prepare for the journey back to civilization, the boy told him the story of how his father had trained the horses to serve as messengers and guardians, teaching them to seek out humans if anything happened to the family, and how the foal had refused to leave the valley entrance for days after David's departure, somehow understanding that its job was to find help for the boy who had become its human brother. Tommy's account of the past week revealed remarkable resilience and survival instincts for someone so young, including his ability to find fresh water, ration his limited food supplies, and maintain hope even when faced with the terrifying possibility that he might never see another human being again. The journey back through the valley and canyon took on an almost mystical quality as the small procession made its way toward Marcus's ranch under a canopy of stars that seemed unusually bright in the clear mountain air, with Tommy riding behind Marcus on Thunder, while the foal trotted alongside them like a proud escort bringing its family home to safety. As they traveled, Tommy shared stories about his life with his father, their reasons for living in hiding, and his dreams of someday having a normal childhood where he could attend school, make friends, and care for horses without worrying about dangerous people finding them. And Marcus found himself making silent promises about the future he would help create for this brave young survivor who had already endured more hardship than most adults would face in a lifetime. The foal seemed to understand that its mission had been successfully completed, occasionally nickering softly, as if reassuring Tommy that everything would be all right now that help had arrived and they were all heading toward a new chapter in their lives together. By the time they reached Copper Ridge Ranch in the early hours of the morning, Marcus had already begun formulating plans that would change all their lives forever. He would contact his lawyer and the appropriate authorities to ensure Tommy's safety and legal protection. He would provide a permanent home for both the boy and the foal that had saved him, and he would use David Brennan's journal as evidence to help law enforcement bring the criminals responsible for this tragedy to justice. As Tommy fell asleep in the ranch house's spare bedroom with the foal standing guard outside his window, Marcus realized that what had begun as a simple encounter with a lost horse had evolved into something much more profound, a story of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between humans and— Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of animal intelligence, compassion, and the profound unspoken bonds between a human and a desperate creature. This narrative aims to highlight the extraordinary emotional depth of animals and the powerful impact of a single act of kindness.